Sometimes a single moment can define an entire life. Sometimes one decision can change the course of history. For Marcus Thompson, that moment came on a cold Tuesday morning when he had to choose between his family's safety and everything he believed was right. What happened next would make headlines across the nation and turn an ordinary man into a symbol of resistance that even the most powerful people couldn't ignore. This is the true story of how one man's refusal to back down created a line in the sand that divided a community, challenged the system, and forced everyone to pick a side. It's about what happens when ordinary people are pushed too far, and how sometimes the most unlikely heroes emerge from the most desperate situations. The spear wasn't just a weapon that day. It became a statement. And Camilla Parker, one of the most influential women in the state, could only watch as everything she had worked for began to crumble with those 5 simple words. This line stands against everyone. Marcus Thompson never thought his life would come to this moment. Standing in his grandfather's old workshop at 6 in the morning, he ran his calloused hands over the ancient spear that had been hanging on the wall for as long as he could remember. The weapon had belonged to his great-great-grandfather, a Civil War veteran, who had carried it through 3 battles and brought it home to their small town of Millbrook Creek. The morning sun filtered through the dusty windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor where Marcus had played as a child. Back then, the spear was just a curiosity, something his grandfather would point to while telling stories about family history and honor. Now, at 42 years old, Marcus understood that some stories weren't just about the past. Some stories were about standing up when everything around you was falling apart. The letter from Parker Development Corporation lay crumpled on his workbench. He had read it so many times that he could recite every word from memory. The company wanted to buy his land, his house, and his workshop to build a luxury shopping center. They offered him 3 times what the property was worth, which should have made him happy. Instead, it made him sick to his stomach. This wasn't just about money. This was about erasing everything that made Millbrook Creek what it was. The Thompson family had lived on this land for 5 generations. His great-great-grandfather had built the first house with his own hands after returning from the war. His grandfather had started the workshop where he repaired farm equipment for every family in the county. His father had expanded it into a proper business that employed 12 people from the community. Marcus looked around the workshop that had been his second home since childhood. The walls were lined with tools that had been passed down through generations, each one worn smooth by decades of honest work. The wooden workbenches bore the scars and stains of countless projects. In the corner stood the old forge that his grandfather had taught him to use when he was barely tall enough to reach the bellows. But it wasn't just his workshop that was in danger. Parker Development had been quietly buying up properties all around Millbrook Creek for the past 2 years. They had purchased the old Miller farm where Marcus had learned to ride horses. This is the big thing Napruze is doing. They'd just admired developed persons. They had bought the Stevens property where the annual town picnic had been held for 30 years. They had even managed to acquire the small church where Marcus had been married to his wife Sarah 15 years ago. The company's plan was ambitious and ruthless. They wanted to transform the entire area into what they called a premium retail destination. The old farmhouses would be demolished to make way for department stores. The creek that gave the town its name would be diverted to create parking lots. The rolling hills where generations of children had played would be flattened to build a 6-lane highway connecting to the interstate. Marcus had attended every town council meeting for the past 6 months, trying to rally opposition to the development. He had organized petition drives and community meetings. He had even hired a lawyer with money he couldn't afford to spend, hoping to find some legal way to stop the project. But, one by one, his neighbors had accepted Parker Development's offers and sold their land. The money was too good to refuse, they said. Their children had already moved to the city anyway. The old ways of life were dying out, and there was no point in fighting progress. Marcus understood their reasoning, but he couldn't accept it. Some things were more important than money. Some things were worth fighting for, even when you were fighting alone. The final blow had come 3 days ago when the town council voted 5-2 in favor of approving Parker Development's rezoning request. The meeting had been packed with people from both sides, but the outcome felt inevitable. Camilla Parker herself had attended. Sitting in the front row with her team of lawyers and consultants, she was an elegant woman in her 50s, always impeccably dressed and supremely confident. She had built Parker Development from a small family construction business into one of the largest development companies in the region. After the vote, Camilla had approached Marcus in the parking lot. Her manner was polite but firm, like a teacher explaining a difficult concept to a slow student. She told him that his resistance was admirable, but ultimately pointless. The project was going to happen with or without his cooperation. He could take their generous offer and relocate somewhere else, or he could force them to use eminent domain proceedings to acquire his property for much less money. Marcus had listened to her speech without saying a word. When she finished, he had simply nodded and walked to his truck. But something had changed in that moment. Something had hardened in his chest like cooling metal. He realized that this wasn't just about his property anymore. This was about drawing a line and saying that some things couldn't be bought at any price. That night, Marcus had sat at his kitchen table with Sarah and their 2 children, discussing what they should do. His wife was practical and worried about their future. She pointed out that they could use Parker Development's money to buy a bigger house in a better school district. Their daughter Emma was starting high school next year, and their son Jake was only 10. They deserved every opportunity to succeed in life. But Emma had surprised them all by speaking up against the sale. She loved their old house with its creaking floors and hidden passages. She loved the workshop where her father had taught her to use tools and fix things with her own hands. She loved the creek where she had spent countless summer afternoons catching tadpoles and building fairy houses. Why should they have to give up everything they loved just so some company could make money? Jake had nodded along with his sister's arguments, though Marcus suspected he was more interested in avoiding the disruption of moving than in preserving family traditions. Still, seeing his children's reactions had strengthened Marcus's resolve. They were looking to him to protect not just their home, but their heritage and their future. Sarah had remained conflicted, caught between practical concerns and emotional attachments. She loved their life in Millbrook Creek, but she also worried about fighting a battle they couldn't win. Parker Development had unlimited resources and political connections. What could one family do against such overwhelming power? The answer had come to Marcus as he stared at the old spear in his workshop. His great-great-grandfather had faced overwhelming odds too, standing with his regiment against superior numbers and better equipment. But sometimes the outcome of a battle wasn't about winning or losing. Sometimes it was about showing the world that someone was willing to stand up and fight for what was right. Marcus lifted the spear from its mounting brackets and tested its weight in his hands. The wooden shaft was still solid after all these years, and the iron point remained sharp. His grandfather had maintained it carefully, oiling the metal and polishing the wood as if it might be needed again someday. Perhaps he had always known that this day would come. The sound of vehicles outside interrupted Marcus's thoughts. Through the window he could see a convoy of black SUVs and pickup trucks pulling into his driveway. Men in suits climbed out of the SUVs while workers in hard hats emerged from the trucks. At the center of the group was Camilla Parker, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. Marcus felt his heart rate increase, but his hands remained steady as he gripped the spear. This was it. All his life had led to this confrontation. This choice between surrender and resistance. He walked to the workshop door and pulled it open, stepping out into the cool morning air. The delegation from Parker Development had arranged themselves in a loose semicircle around his property, like a military force preparing to take possession of conquered territory. Camilla stood at the front of the group, flanked by her lawyers and security personnel. "Thompson," she called out in her clear, authoritative voice, "I hope you've had time to reconsider our offer. My people are here to begin the preliminary site survey, as authorized by the town council's vote." Marcus walked slowly across the yard toward the group, the spear held loosely in his right hand. He could see the uncertainty in some of their faces as they noticed the weapon. A few of the workers took half a step backward, but Camilla remained perfectly still. "This is private property," Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly in the morning silence. "You're not welcome here." One of the lawyers stepped forward, pulling a folder from his briefcase. "Thompson, we have all the necessary documentation. The town council has authorized this survey under the Municipal Development Statute. If you interfere with our work, you could face criminal charges." Marcus stopped about 20 feet from the group and planted the butt of the spear firmly in the ground beside him. The iron point gleamed in the morning sunlight as he leaned against the weapon's shaft. He looked directly at Camilla as he spoke. "I don't care about your papers or your statutes. This land belongs to my family. It's been ours for 5 generations and it's going to stay ours. You want to build your shopping center somewhere else." Camilla's expression didn't change, but Marcus could see a flicker of impatience in her eyes. She was a woman accustomed to getting her way, especially when dealing with what she probably considered simple country folk. "Mr. Thompson, I understand your emotional attachment to this property, but you need to accept reality. This project is happening whether you participate willingly or not. The only question is whether you'll benefit from it financially." "Some things aren't for sale," Marcus replied. "This is one of them." One of the security men whispered something to Camilla, probably advising her about the potential danger of the situation. Marcus wasn't threatening anyone, but an armed man defending his property could quickly escalate into violence if handled wrong. Camilla waved off her security team's concerns. She had built her career by facing down opposition and finding ways around obstacles. One stubborn farmer with an antique weapon wasn't going to stop her biggest project. Mr. Kellis. Thompson, let me explain something to you. Parker Development has invested over $50 million in this project. We have contracts with major retailers, architects, and construction companies. We have commitments from investors and lenders. Hundreds of jobs depend on this development moving forward on schedule. She gestured toward the rolling hills and farmland that surrounded Marcus's property. This entire area is going to be transformed into something beneficial for the whole region. New businesses, new employment opportunities, increased tax revenue for local schools and services. You're standing in the way of progress that will help thousands of people. Marcus listened to her speech without moving from his position beside the spear. He had heard similar arguments at every town council meeting, always delivered with the same tone of reasonable authority. The developers always framed their projects as benefits for the community, never mentioning the communities they destroyed in the process. Progress, Marcus repeated slowly, as if tasting the word. Is that what you call it when you tear down everything that makes a place special and replace it with the same stores you can find anywhere else? I call it economic development. Camilla replied firmly. I call it bringing opportunity to an area that desperately needs it. How many young people leave Millbrook Creek every year because there are no good jobs here? How many businesses have closed because there aren't enough customers to support them? And your solution is to make this place exactly like everywhere else, Marcus said. Turn it into another generic shopping district where nobody knows their neighbors and nothing has any history or meaning. The two sides stared at each other across the morning air, representing completely different visions of what progress meant. Behind Camilla, her team of lawyers and consultants shifted impatiently, checking their watches and phones. They had other appointments to keep and other deals to close. This resistance was an inconvenience they needed to resolve quickly. Behind Marcus stood his workshop and his home, representing 5 generations of family history and community ties. Sarah appeared in the doorway of the house, watching the confrontation with worried eyes. Emma and Jake peered out from behind their mother, trying to understand what was happening to their world. The morning sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the yard, where 2 different ways of life faced each other in an ancient confrontation. This was the same struggle that had been fought in countless communities across the country, between those who saw land as an investment opportunity and those who saw it as home. Camilla took a step forward, her voice taking on a slightly sharper edge. Mr. Thompson, I've tried to be reasonable with you. I've offered you more money than this property is worth by any objective measure, but my patience has limits. If you don't accept our offer voluntarily, we'll proceed with eminent domain. You'll get fair market value for your property, but not the premium we're currently offering. Fair market value, Marcus said, shaking his head. You people really don't understand, do you? You think everything can be reduced to dollars and cents. You think you can just write a check and erase 5 generations of family history. He tightened his grip on the spear and took a half step forward. The movement was subtle, but everyone in the yard felt the shift in tension. This was no longer just a business negotiation. This had become something deeper and more dangerous. Let me tell you something about fair market value, Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger. My great-great-grandfather bought this land with blood and sacrifice after fighting in a war that nearly tore this country apart. My grandfather built this workshop with his own hands and used it to help every family in this county when they needed equipment repaired or tools made. My father expanded the business and employed people from this community for 30 years. He gestured toward the house where his family stood watching. My wife and I raised our children on this land. We taught them about responsibility and hard work and taking care of what's been entrusted to you. That's not something you can put a price tag on. That's not something you can replace with money. Camilla's expression remained composed, but Marcus could see the calculation in her eyes. She was weighing the costs of different approaches to this problem. A prolonged legal battle would delay the project and increase expenses. Bad publicity about forcing a family from their ancestral home could damage her company's reputation. But backing down would set a precedent that other property owners might exploit. Mr. Thompson, she said finally, I respect your family's history with this property. But individual sentiment can't override the greater good. This development will create hundreds of jobs and bring millions of dollars in economic activity to the region. Sometimes personal sacrifice is necessary for the benefit of the community. Personal sacrifice, Marcus repeated, his voice heavy with irony. You mean my sacrifice for your benefit? You mean destroying my family's heritage so you can make more money? The standoff continued as the morning sun climbed higher in the sky. Neither side was willing to back down, but neither was quite ready to escalate the situation further. The tension hung in the air like an approaching storm, electric and dangerous. Then Camilla made a decision that would change everything. She nodded to her security team and stepped back slightly, giving them room to move forward. "Mr. Thompson, I'm giving you one final opportunity to resolve this peacefully. Accept our offer and relocate your family to a better situation. Or we'll proceed with the legal process and you'll lose your property anyway, but with much less compensation." Marcus felt the weight of 5 generations of family history pressing down on his shoulders. He thought about his great-great-grandfather, standing in a battle line with enemy soldiers charging toward him. He thought about his grandfather working 16-hour days to keep the farm going during the Depression. He thought about his father refusing to sell the business to a corporate chain even when money was tight. All of them had faced moments when they could have chosen the easy path, when they could have walked away from their responsibilities. But they had stood their ground because some things were more important than personal comfort or financial gain. They had understood that certain battles had to be fought not because victory was guaranteed, but because the alternative was unacceptable. Marcus raised the spear and planted it firmly in the ground directly in front of him. The iron point caught the morning sunlight and threw it back like a beacon. His voice carried clearly across the yard as he spoke the words that would define everything that followed. "This line stands against everyone who thinks they can buy what isn't for sale. This line stands against everyone who thinks money is more important than family and community and history. This line stands against everyone who wants to turn this place into just another strip of generic businesses that could be anywhere." He looked directly at Camilla as he delivered the final words. "This line stands against everyone, and you're not crossing it today." The silence that followed his declaration seemed to stretch on forever. Everyone in the yard understood that something fundamental had changed in that moment. This was no longer a business dispute that could be resolved through negotiation or legal maneuvering. This had become a test of will, a confrontation between 2 completely different ways of seeing the world. Camilla stared at Marcus across the space between them, her mind racing through possibilities and consequences. She had built her career by finding ways around obstacles, but she had never faced anything quite like this. The man standing before her wasn't motivated by money or fear or rational self-interest. He was motivated by something much more dangerous and unpredictable: principle. Behind her, the lawyers were whispering urgently among themselves, trying to figure out the legal implications of the situation. The security team was tensed and ready, but uncertain about how to proceed. The workers stood around looking confused and uncomfortable, caught between their jobs and their sympathy for a man defending his home. The morning air seemed to shimmer with possibility and threat. Everything that happened next would flow from this moment, from the line that Marcus Thompson had drawn in the dirt of his family's land. Some lines, once drawn, could never be erased. The news of Marcus Thompson's stand against Parker Development spread through Millbrook Creek like wildfire on a dry summer day. By noon, the first reporters had arrived, drawn by the dramatic image of one man with an antique spear facing down a multi-million-dollar corporation. By evening, the story had reached the regional news stations, and by the next morning, it was being discussed on national television. Sarah Thompson stood in her kitchen, watching through the window as more vehicles arrived throughout the day. News vans with satellite dishes lined the county road. Reporters set up cameras and interviewed anyone willing to talk. Curious neighbors and strangers drove by slowly, trying to get a glimpse of the man who had become an overnight symbol of resistance. Marcus remained at his post beside the workshop, the spear planted firmly in the ground next to him. He had barely moved since his confrontation with Camilla Parker 12 hours earlier. Friends and neighbors brought him food and water, but he refused to leave his position. The line he had drawn was more than symbolic now. It had become a physical boundary that he would not abandon. The immediate crisis had passed when Camilla decided not to force the issue that first morning. Her lawyers had advised caution, warning that any violence could create a public relations disaster and legal complications. Instead, she had withdrawn her team to regroup and plan their next move. But everyone knew this was only a temporary retreat. Parker Development had too much invested in the project to simply walk away. The media attention brought unexpected complications and opportunities for both sides. For Marcus, it meant that his private family dispute had become a public cause. Reporters wanted to know about his background, his motivations, and his plans. They framed the story as a classic David versus Goliath battle, with Marcus as the heroic underdog fighting against corporate greed. But the coverage also brought scrutiny that made Marcus uncomfortable. Television crews filmed his house and workshop from every angle. Reporters interviewed his neighbors, his customers, and even his children's teachers. Every detail of his life was suddenly fair game for public consumption. Emma Thompson found herself at the center of unwanted attention at school. Classmates who had barely noticed her before now surrounded her with questions about her father and their family situation. Some were supportive, calling her dad a hero for standing up to the developers. Others were critical, saying he was being selfish and hurting the community by blocking economic progress. The division in public opinion reflected deeper tensions within Millbrook Creek itself. The town had been struggling economically for years as young people moved away and local businesses closed. Parker Development's project promised to bring jobs and tax revenue that could revitalize the area. Many residents supported the development, even if they admired Marcus's courage in opposing it. Town Council member Patricia Williams found herself in an impossible position. She had voted against the Parker Development project, but she understood the practical arguments in favor of it. The town desperately needed economic development, and they couldn't afford to turn down major investment opportunities. At the same time, she recognized that something valuable was being lost when communities abandoned their history and character in pursuit of economic growth. Williams visited Marcus on the second day of his vigil, bringing coffee and homemade cookies from her wife's bakery. She found him sitting on a folding chair that Sarah had brought out, still maintaining his position next to the spear. He looked tired but determined, like a sentry who understood the importance of his duty. "Marcus, you know I support what you're trying to do here," Williams said as she handed him the coffee. "But I'm worried about how this is going to end. Camilla Parker isn't going to give up, and she has resources we can't match." Marcus accepted the coffee gratefully and took a long sip before responding. "Patricia, I've been thinking about this all night. I know I can't stop them forever with just this spear and my stubbornness, but maybe that's not the point anymore." He gestured toward the reporters and cameras set up around his property. "Look at all this attention. People are talking about what happens when corporations try to bulldoze communities. They're asking questions about who really benefits from these development projects. Maybe that conversation is worth having even if I lose my land in the end." Williams nodded thoughtfully. She had been involved in local politics long enough to understand how rare it was for small communities to get any attention for their struggles against powerful interests. Usually these battles were fought and lost in obscurity with no one outside the immediate area caring about the outcome. "Have you thought about what you want to accomplish here?" she asked. "I mean specifically. Are you trying to stop the project entirely, or are you hoping to negotiate some kind of compromise?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring across his property toward the creek that wound through the valley. "I want them to understand that this place matters. That it's not just empty land waiting to be developed. I want them to see that communities aren't just collections of buildings and businesses. They're made up of relationships and memories and shared history." He turned back to Williams with a slight smile. "Maybe that's too much to ask from a development company. But if enough people start thinking about these questions, maybe the next community won't have to fight this battle alone." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another news van, this one from a national cable network. The reporter who emerged was perfectly groomed and professionally aggressive, the kind of person who specialized in turning complex local issues into simple national narratives. Marcus watched warily as the reporter approached, trailed by a cameraman and sound technician. He had already learned to be careful about how he presented his case to the media. Some reporters genuinely wanted to understand the issues involved, while others were just looking for dramatic footage and quotable sound bites.
"Mr. Thompson, I'm Jennifer Martinez from CNN.
"Could I ask you a few questions about your standoff with Parker Development?" Marcus nodded reluctantly. He understood that media attention was both his greatest asset and his biggest vulnerability. The coverage had brought support from people across the country who identified with his struggle, but it had also painted a target on his back for those who saw him as an obstacle to progress. "Mr. Thompson, critics say you're being selfish by blocking a project that would create hundreds of jobs and bring millions of dollars in investment to this area. How do you respond to that?" The question was delivered with the aggressive neutrality that television journalists used when they wanted to create conflict.
Marcus had heard variations of it dozens of times over the past 2 days, and he had learned to answer carefully.
"I'm not against economic development," he said, looking directly into the camera. "I'm against development that destroys everything valuable about a community in order to create something generic and soulless. There are ways to grow and improve without erasing history and displacing families. But Parker Development is offering you 3 times what your property is worth. Isn't this really about getting even more money?" Marcus felt a flash of anger at the implication, but he kept his voice level. "If this was about money, I would have taken their first offer 2 years ago and moved to Florida. This is about principle. It's about saying that some things are more important than profit margins." The reporter pressed further, sensing that she might provoke a more dramatic response. "Mr. Thompson, Parker Development has suggested that you're grandstanding for the media attention. They say you're using the situation to become famous at the expense of your community's economic future. Now, Marcus did allow some heat to enter his voice. Famous? Do you think I wanted reporters camped out in my yard asking my children about our family business? Do you think I wanted to become a symbol in some national debate? I just want to protect my home and my heritage. Everything else is something that other people have imposed on this situation. Williams watched the interview with growing concern. She could see how the reporter was trying to maneuver Marcus into saying something that could be taken out of context or used against him. The media attention that had initially helped his cause was becoming a double-edged sword that could easily cut against him. After the reporter finished her interview and moved on to find other people to question, Williams pulled Marcus aside for a private conversation. Marcus, I think you need to be more careful about what you say to these reporters. Some of them aren't on your side, and they're looking for ways to make you look bad. Marcus rubbed his eyes wearily. The stress of maintaining his vigil while dealing with constant media attention was taking a toll. I know, Patricia, but what choice do I have? If I don't talk to them, they'll just interview other people and control the narrative completely. At least this way I can try to explain what this is really about. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a different kind of visitor. A black sedan pulled up to the edge of the property, and a well-dressed man in his 60s emerged. Marcus recognized him immediately. Thomas Parker, Camilla's father, and the founder of Parker Development. Thomas Parker was a legend in regional business circles. He had built the company from nothing in the 1970s, starting with small residential projects and gradually expanding into commercial development. He was known for being tough but fair in his business dealings, and he had a reputation for personal integrity that even his competitors respected. The older man walked slowly across the yard, his hands clasped behind his back in a gesture that suggested contemplation rather than confrontation. Marcus straightened in his chair but didn't move from his position next to the spear. Mr. Thompson, Thomas Parker said when he was close enough to speak without raising his voice. I'm Tom Parker. I think we should talk. Marcus nodded cautiously. He had expected this encounter eventually, though he wasn't sure what to make of it. Thomas Parker's involvement could mean that the company was preparing to escalate their pressure, or it might indicate that they were looking for a way to resolve the situation without further conflict. Mr. Parker, I assume you're here to make me another offer I can't refuse? The older man smiled slightly. Actually, I'm here because I want to understand what you're really trying to accomplish. My daughter thinks you're either crazy or calculating, but I suspect there's something else going on here. Marcus studied Thomas Parker's face, trying to read his intentions. There was something different about his approach compared to Camilla's aggressive professionalism. He seemed genuinely curious rather than simply trying to overcome an obstacle. What I'm trying to accomplish is pretty simple, Mr. Parker. I'm trying to save my family's home and preserve what's left of this community. Your company wants to erase both of those things to build another shopping center. Can you think one man with a spear can stop a $50 million development project? Marcus shook his head. I'm not trying to stop progress, Mr. Parker. I'm trying to change what we mean by progress. I'm trying to show people that there's more to consider than just economic benefits when we make decisions about how communities develop. Thomas Parker was quiet for a moment, looking around at the property and the surrounding landscape. Marcus could see him taking inventory of the buildings, the land, and the natural features that would be affected by the development. Thompson, can I ask you something? What would it take for you to support this project? I mean, specifically, what changes would we have to make for you to see it as progress rather than destruction? The question caught Marcus off guard. He had been so focused on opposing the development that he hadn't really considered whether there might be ways to modify it that would address his concerns. I don't know, he admitted. I hadn't really thought about compromise. Your company's plan calls for demolishing everything and starting over. That doesn't leave much room for preserving what's already here. Thomas Parker nodded thoughtfully. What if we could find a way to incorporate some of the existing structures into the development? What if we could preserve the creek and some of the natural areas? What if we could create something that brought economic development without completely erasing the community's character? Marcus felt a flicker of interest despite himself. You're talking about a completely different kind of project. Would your investors and retailers accept something like that? I don't know, Thomas Parker admitted. It would be more complicated and probably more expensive. But it might also be more successful in the long run. People are getting tired of generic shopping centers that look the same everywhere. There might be a market for something more authentic and connected to the local community. The two men talked for another hour, exploring possibilities that neither had considered before. Marcus found himself cautiously optimistic about Thomas Parker's approach, while still skeptical about whether the company would actually follow through on any compromises. Their conversation was observed by the gathered reporters, who speculated about what it might mean for the standoff. Some saw it as a sign that Marcus was wavering in his opposition, while others interpreted it as evidence that Parker Development was looking for a face-saving way to back down from their original plan. Camilla Parker watched the coverage of her father's meeting with Marcus from her office in the city, her frustration growing with each news report. She had spent 2 years putting together the financing and partnerships for this project, and she couldn't understand why they were suddenly considering major changes to accommodate one stubborn landowner. That evening, she drove to Millbrook Creek to confront both her father and Marcus directly. She found them still talking on Marcus's property, surrounded by media representatives and curious onlookers. The scene had taken on a carnival atmosphere that made serious negotiation almost impossible. "Dad, what are you doing here?" Camilla asked when she reached the two men. Her tone was carefully controlled, but Marcus could see the tension in her posture. "I'm trying to understand what Mr. Coxsack Thompson is really asking for," Thomas Parker replied. "And I'm wondering if there might be a way to give it to him without abandoning our project entirely."
Camilla's professional composure cracked slightly.
"Dad, we have contracts and commitments. We can't just redesign everything because one person doesn't like our plans. This project has been in development for 3 years. We've spent millions of dollars on planning and preparation. And we'll spend millions more if we get into a prolonged legal battle," her father pointed out, "especially with all this media attention. Bad publicity can be more expensive than design changes." Marcus listened to the family argument with mixed feelings. Part of him was encouraged by Thomas Parker's apparent willingness to consider alternatives. But another part was suspicious that this was just another negotiating tactic designed to wear down his resistance. "Mr. Parker," he interrupted, "I appreciate your willingness to talk about compromise. But I need to know that you're serious about making real changes, not just cosmetic modifications that let you claim you listen to community concerns." Thomas Parker turned back to Marcus with a serious expression. "Thompson, I've been in this business for 50 years. I've seen communities destroyed by thoughtless development, and I've seen them revitalized by projects that respected local character and history. I'd rather build something we can all be proud of than something that just maximizes short-term profits." Camilla stared at her father in disbelief. This wasn't the hard-nosed businessman who had taught her that sentiment was luxury they couldn't afford in competitive markets. This sounded like someone who was willing to sacrifice profit margins for abstract principles. "Dad, we need to talk privately," she said firmly. Thomas Parker nodded and turned back to Marcus. "Mr. Thompson, I'm going to propose something to you. Give me 1 week to explore whether we can modify this project in ways that address your concerns. If we can come up with something that preserves what you're trying to protect while still providing economic benefits to the community, would you be willing to consider it?" Marcus looked toward his house, where Sarah was watching from the window, with a mixture of hope and anxiety. He thought about his children, who deserved to grow up in a community that valued both progress and tradition. He thought about his neighbors, who needed economic opportunities, but didn't want to lose everything that made their home special. 1 week, he agreed. "But I'm not moving from this spot until I see real plans that show how you're going to preserve what matters here." Thomas Parker extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Marcus shook it. The gesture was captured by dozens of cameras and would appear in news reports around the country as a symbol of hope that compromise might be possible even in the most contentious disputes. But as the Parker family walked back to their vehicles for their private discussion, Marcus wondered if he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Compromise sounded reasonable in theory, but he had learned to be suspicious of promises made by people with millions of dollars at stake. The spear remained planted in the ground beside him, a reminder that some lines couldn't be negotiated away. The week that followed Thomas Parker's promise became the longest 7 days of Marcus Thompson's life. He maintained his vigil beside the workshop, but the nature of his stand had changed. Instead of simply resisting, he was now waiting to see if genuine compromise was possible. The uncertainty was almost harder to bear than outright opposition. Media attention intensified as the deadline approached. National news programs sent their most experienced correspondents to cover what they were calling the battle for Millbrook Creek. Editorial writers across the country used Marcus's story as a launching point for broader discussions about development, community rights, and the meaning of progress in modern America. The attention brought support from unexpected quarters. A crowdfunding campaign started by a sympathetic blogger raised over $200,000 for Marcus's legal expenses. Environmental groups offered to help fight the development on ecological grounds. Historical Preservation Society sent experts to document the cultural significance of the Thompson property and the surrounding area. But the support also came with pressure to maintain his resistance regardless of what Parker Development might propose. Activist organizations that had adopted Marcus as a symbol of their causes urged him not to compromise with corporate interests. Some supporters seemed more interested in using his struggle for their own political purposes than in achieving the best outcome for his family and community. Marcus found himself caught between competing expectations and loyalties. His original goal had been simple: protect his family's land and preserve his community's character. Now he was being asked to represent broader principles that he wasn't sure he fully understood or endorsed. The stress was affecting his entire family. Sarah worried constantly about their financial situation and their children's future. The legal bills were mounting despite the crowdfunding support, and Marcus's business had ground to a halt while he maintained his public vigil. Customers who might normally bring equipment to his workshop were reluctant to get involved in the controversy. Emma and Jake struggled with their sudden notoriety. Emma found herself torn between pride in her father's principles and embarrassment about the media circus surrounding their family. Jake, who was too young to fully understand the issues involved, simply wanted everything to return to normal so he could play outside without reporters watching his every move. On the fourth day of the waiting period, Marcus received an unexpected visitor. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a professor of urban planning from the State University, had driven down to interview him for a research project about community resistance to development. She was a small, intense woman in her 40s who spoke with the rapid-fire precision of someone accustomed to academic debate. "Mr. Thompson, I've been following your situation with great interest," she said as she set up a small recording device. "What you're doing here represents a classic case of what we call place attachment, coming into conflict with economic development pressures." Marcus wasn't sure he liked being reduced to a case study, but he was curious about Dr. Martinez's perspective. Place attachment? It's the emotional bond that people form with specific locations. It's based on personal history, social relationships, and cultural meaning rather than just economic value. What you're fighting for isn't really the physical property itself, it's what that property represents to you and your family. She gestured toward the workshop and the surrounding landscape. This place is part of your identity in a way that Parker Development can't understand or replicate. They see land as a commodity to be developed for maximum profit. You see it as home, heritage, and community. Those are fundamentally incompatible worldviews.
Marcus nodded thoughtfully.
So you don't think compromise is possible? I think compromise is always possible, in theory. Dr. Takis, Martinez replied, but it requires both sides to acknowledge the legitimacy of the other's concerns. Most development companies aren't willing to accept that communities have values that can't be measured in dollars and cents. Their conversation was interrupted by commotion near the road. A convoy of vehicles was approaching, led by Thomas Parker's distinctive black sedan. Behind it came several trucks carrying what appeared to be architectural models and presentation materials. Marcus felt his heart rate increase as the vehicles parked and people began unloading equipment. This was it. The moment he had been waiting for and dreading in equal measure. Either Parker Development had found a way to address his concerns, or this was an elaborate show designed to make his continued resistance seem unreasonable. Thomas Parker emerged from the lead vehicle, followed by Camilla and a team of architects, engineers, and planners. The group moved with purpose, but Marcus noticed that the atmosphere was different from their first confrontation. There was less tension and more genuine anticipation. "Mr. Thompson," Thomas Parker called out as the group approached. "We're ready to show you what we've developed. I think you're going to find it interesting." The architects quickly set up a presentation area, using portable tables and display boards. Within minutes, they had created a temporary outdoor office, complete with detailed drawings, scale models, and computer-generated visualizations. Marcus stood beside his spear, studying the materials being arranged before him. The models looked different from the original development plans he had seen months earlier. Instead of a monolithic shopping complex, he saw a design that incorporated multiple buildings of varying sizes scattered across a much larger area. Thomas Parker stepped forward to begin the presentation. "Mr. Thompson, what we're proposing is what we're calling Heritage Commons. Instead of demolishing everything and starting over, we want to preserve and incorporate the existing structures into a mixed-use development that celebrates the area's history and character." He pointed to a detailed model that showed Marcus's workshop and house occupying a central position in the new development. "Your workshop would become the cornerstone of an artisan village, where local craftspeople could sell their work and demonstrate traditional skills. Your house would be preserved as a visitor center that tells the story of the area's agricultural heritage. Marcus stared at the model in amazement. It was unlike anything he'd expected. Instead of erasing his family's presence from the landscape, the new plan seemed to make them the focal point of the entire project. The creek would be protected and enhanced with walking trails and natural areas, continued one of the architects. We're proposing to relocate some of the retail spaces to areas that are currently unused farmland, reducing the environmental impact while preserving the most historically significant structures. Camilla stepped forward, her expression carefully neutral. The revised plan would cost approximately 20% more than our original proposal, but our market research suggests that consumers are increasingly interested in authentic experiences rather than generic shopping environments. Marcus walked around the presentation area, studying the models and drawings from different angles. The design was sophisticated and thoughtful in ways that surprised him. It seemed to address many of his concerns while still providing the economic development that the community needed.
What about the other properties you've already purchased? He asked.
The Miller Farm, the Stevens Place, the old church. We're proposing to incorporate all of them into the heritage theme, Thomas Parker replied. The Miller farmhouse would be restored as a restaurant featuring local agriculture and traditional recipes. The church would be preserved as a community event space. We're even planning to relocate some of the commercial spaces to create a town square around the church. Dr. Martinez, who had been quietly observing the presentation, stepped forward with a question. Mr. Parker, this is a beautiful plan, but how do you ensure that the heritage elements aren't just window dressing? How do you prevent this from becoming a theme park version of authentic community? It was a crucial question, and Marcus was grateful that someone with academic expertise was there to ask it. The difference between genuine preservation and commercialized nostalgia was exactly what he was concerned about. Thomas Parker nodded appreciatively at the question. That's something we've thought about extensively, Dr. Martinez. The key is to maintain actual functionality, rather than just creating museum pieces. Mr. Thompson's workshop would continue to operate as a working business, not just a display. The artisan village would house real craftspeople producing and selling actual products. He pointed to another section of the model. We're also proposing to reserve 30% of the retail spaces for locally owned businesses at below-market rents. The goal is to support existing community enterprises rather than just bringing in national chains. Marcus found himself cautiously impressed despite his skepticism. The plan addressed most of his major concerns and seemed to offer genuine benefits to the community, but he was still wary of making commitments based on promises and presentations. This all sounds good in theory, he said carefully. But how do I know you'll follow through on these commitments? What happens if market conditions change or your investors decide they want something different? Camilla answered this question. We're prepared to put all of these preservation and community support commitments into legally binding agreements. They would be enforced by the town council and could be challenged in court if we failed to meet them. Sarah had emerged from the house and was studying the presentations with obvious interest. Marcus could see hope and relief in her expression as she examined the plans that would preserve their home while providing economic security for their family. Emma and Jake had also come outside, drawn by curiosity about the activity in their yard. Emma was studying the model with the intense focus she brought to school projects, trying to understand how their familiar landscape would be transformed. "Dad," she said quietly, "it looks like they're trying to keep what we love about this place while making it better for everyone."
Marcus felt the weight of decision pressing down on him.
This was what he had asked for, a development plan that respected community values while providing economic benefits. But accepting it would mean abandoning his role as a symbol of resistance and disappointing supporters who had invested in his struggle. "I need time to think about this," he said finally, "and I need to discuss it with my family and the community. This isn't just my decision anymore." Thomas Parker nodded understandingly. "Of course. Take all the time you need. But I want you to know that this proposal represents a genuine commitment from our company to do development differently. We've learned a lot from this process, and I think we can create something that serves as a model for other communities facing similar challenges." As the Parker development team packed up their presentation materials, Marcus remained beside his spear, deep in thought. The proposal was more generous and thoughtful than he had dared to hope. It seemed to offer a way forward that honored his principles while serving his community's needs. But he also knew that accepting the compromise would mean redefining what his stand had accomplished.
Instead of stopping development, he would be changing its character.
Instead of preserving the status quo, he would be embracing a vision of managed change that balanced competing values and interests. That evening, Marcus called a community meeting at the high school gymnasium. The building was packed with residents who had been following the controversy and wanted to understand what the new proposal might mean for their town. Marcus stood at the front of the room, still wearing the work clothes he had worn throughout his vigil.
The spear leaned against the wall behind him, a reminder of the confrontation that had started everything. "Friends and neighbors," he began. "A week ago I planted that spear in the ground and said it represented a line that couldn't be crossed.
Tonight I want to talk about what that line really means and whether we've found a way to honor it while moving forward together." He described the Heritage Commons proposal in detail, explaining how it would preserve historical structures while creating new economic opportunities. He talked about the legal commitments that would protect community interests and the provisions for supporting local businesses. The response was mixed but generally positive. Many residents were relieved that Marcus seemed to be considering compromise rather than prolonged conflict. Others were concerned that any acceptance of development would set a precedent that could be exploited by future projects. Patricia Williams spoke from the audience. "Marcus, I think what you've accomplished here goes beyond saving your own property. You've shown that communities can negotiate with developers as equals if they're willing to stand up for their values. This proposal exists because you drew that line and refused to back down from it." Dr. Martinez, who had stayed for the community meeting, offered a different perspective. "Mr. Thompson, what you're being offered is unprecedented in my experience. I've studied dozens of similar conflicts, and I've never seen a development company make this kind of commitment to genuine historic preservation and community integration." Marcus listened to all the comments and questions, but the decision ultimately came down to his own judgment about what was best for his family and his community. Late that night, he sat in his workshop surrounded by the tools and memories of 5 generations, trying to understand what his ancestors would have wanted him to do. The next morning, Marcus walked out to where the spears still stood planted in the ground. Media representatives and curious onlookers gathered, as they had for the past week, expecting another day of waiting and speculation. Instead, Marcus pulled the spear from the earth and held it upright beside him. His voice carried clearly across the yard as he addressed the assembled crowd. "This spear has stood for the principle that some things are more important than money and that communities have the right to shape their own future. Today I'm here to say that Parker Development has shown they understand those principles and are willing to honor them." He paused, looking around at the faces of neighbors, reporters, and strangers who had gathered to witness this moment. "The line I drew wasn't just about stopping development. It was about demanding development that respects who we are and where we come from. Heritage Commons represents that kind of development." Marcus turned towards the cameras that would carry his words across the country. "To everyone who has supported our struggle, I want you to know that we haven't surrendered our principles. We've achieved something better than victory. We've achieved progress that honors the past while building for the future." Camilla Parker stepped forward from where she had been waiting with her father and their team. Her expression was professional but respectful as she approached Marcus. "Mr. Thompson, Parker Development is proud to partner with the Millbrook Creek community in creating Heritage Commons. We've learned that the best developments aren't built on empty land. They're built on the foundation of community values and shared vision." Marcus shook her offered hand, and the gesture was captured by photographers who understood its symbolic significance. This wasn't just the end of a dispute. It was the beginning of a new kind of relationship between development and community.
Monsieur l'Avesseur de Gers?
As the crowd began to disperse and the immediate drama came to an end, Marcus carried the spear back to its place on the workshop wall. The weapon had served its purpose, not by fighting but by representing the willingness to fight for principles that couldn't be compromised. Sarah joined him in the workshop, looking around at the space that would soon become part of something larger, while remaining essentially what it had always been, a place where useful things were made and problems were solved with skill and dedication.
"Are you sure about this?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew his answer.
Marcus nodded, feeling a sense of peace that had been absent since the first development notice arrived 2 years earlier. "The line stands," he said quietly. "It just stands for something different now. It stands for the idea that progress and tradition don't have to be enemies. It stands for communities that refuse to choose between their heritage and their future." Outside, construction crews would soon begin the careful work of building Heritage Commons around and through the existing structures that had defined Millbrook Creek for generations. The project would take 3 years to complete and would serve as a model for similar developments across the region. Marcus would continue to operate his workshop, now expanded to include apprenticeship programs and educational demonstrations. Emma would grow up to become an architect specializing in historic preservation. Jake would inherit the family business and eventually expand it into a craft cooperative that supported artisans throughout the region. The spear would remain on the workshop wall, no longer a weapon but a symbol of the principle that had guided Marcus through his moment of decision. Sometimes the most important battles are won, not by defeating the opposition, but by showing them a better way forward. The line had held, and in holding, it had changed everything.